back to the swordbox. Today we arrive at the book of Daniel. And the book of Daniel is titled after its author and central figure, Daniel. Probably considered the greatest prophetic book of the Old Testament, the book of Daniel is full of God's revelations that are given through dreams and visions, described oftentimes in symbols that can require a lot of study and even knowledge of history to understand. We also have the accounts in Daniel of Daniel and his 3 friends who were taken captive from Jerusalem by the Babylonians and handpicked to be trained for service in the king's palace. Daniel covers the 7 years of Babylonian captivity and contains some of the most familiar stories of the Bible. Among them are the account of the king's required diet and Daniel's stand to obey God's food laws. We have Daniel's interpretation of the king's dreams. We have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And of course, we have Daniel in the lion's den and the writing on the wall. So the book of Daniel is an awesome, action-packed book of the Bible. But today I want us to focus on something very important. Daniel and his friends were faithful to God to keep His commandments even when it meant going against man's authority. From not violating God's food laws to refusing to bow down and worship a statue to refusal to stop praying to God, Daniel and his friends were unmoved in their commitment to follow the Lord, even when the consequences for doing so meant death. But there is something that Daniel always maintained while standing his ground. He maintained his respectful attitude and response towards authority. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. Paul said in Acts 5:29 that we ought to obey God rather than man. But he didn't mean that we're not to obey man's authority, that we're to be disrespectful or rebellious and disobedient. Titus 3:1, we're instructed to remind them to be subject to the rulers and authorities to obey. So which is it? Do we obey God or do we obey man? Well, the only times we as Christians are to disobey man's authority here on earth is whether it's government laws or whether it's school or whatever authority God has placed over you, is when man tells us to do something that God has told us not to do, or when man tells us not to do something that God has commanded us to do. But even when we must obey God over man, it is never to be done in a spirit or an attitude of rebelliousness and disrespect. When Daniel was confronted with having to submit to the king's special diet, it was in direct violation of God's food laws for the Jews. Yet Daniel realized that he was under the authority of the king and his officers, and was at all times respectful to them. In Daniel 1:8, the Bible says, "But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food, or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself." Daniel didn't just refuse to obey his authority and develop an attitude of rebellion. Rather, he humbled himself and asked permission not to eat the king's food. He then offered to show God's food laws to be superior by a 10-day trial. Now, perhaps every situation can't be worked out like this one was, but in each situation, we can still be respectful and be humble towards those who are in authority over us, understanding that showing proper reverence to the authority is showing proper reverence for God who placed the authority there. If we show disrespect to the government or to the authority over us, even when in principle we're obeying God, we lose our witness and we're sinning against God, because it's Him who has placed all authority where it is. When we resist authority, the Bible says we're resisting God. So anytime we have to violate man's laws, we must make sure that we're not only taking the right stand, but that we are respectful towards the authority and obedient in all other points that do not violate God's laws. Romans 13:1-2 says, "Let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves." You know, there's no distinction made here between authority being good, just, and kind, or the authority being wicked, mean, and unfair. We're to submit to the governing authorities because God has commanded us to do so. You know, even after Daniel had been thrown into the lion's den because he had prayed to God, his first words to the king the next day were, "O king, live forever." Doesn't sound like someone with a rebellious attitude towards authority. Even though Daniel had to obey God over the king's decree, he never quit showing respect and honor to the king and his authority. You remember King David back when Saul was king of Israel and was out to kill David. David had the opportunity to kill King Saul, but he didn't. Saul pursued David with 3,000 men, and when David had Saul at his mercy, he restrained himself. He said in 1 Samuel 24:6, "And he said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of God." It would seem David had every right to take Saul's life. Saul was living in rebellion to God. God had already anointed David king, and Saul was unjustly seeking to take David's life. But David respected and honored the position of authority given by God to King Saul. And even though Saul was wicked, what an awesome display of respect David had for God's authority. It certainly didn't mean David had to stop running and allow Saul to kill him. He didn't. But at the same time, David set a godly example to his men, to Saul and Saul's men, as well as for all of us who read this passage today and get to see this principle in action. Any refusal to obey man's authority and laws must be only to obey and to glorify God, never for our own personal preference or for our egos or for our desires. It is always to be done in reverence to God for the authority that He has placed in our lives. God bless you. Hope to see you back here tomorrow on Swordbox with 66 books in 66 days.